my microphone on? Anybody hear me? I hear me. Oh, I guess it looks like the clock says it's time to get started, so let's do that. You know, I used to do this when I was teaching chemistry, and I had a hard time then too, so. Good morning. It's what? You know, I can do that. Well, but it's been a few years.
You know what time it is.
I do know what time it is. I can see right back there. So. I saw who was keeping us tied up, so I'm judging you. Well, good morning, all. In case you hadn't noticed, I'm not David Tucker. He is the one slated to do class this morning, but he's got granddaughters in Arkansas in a school play. You know, they are way more important than you guys are. So he's in Arkansas, and he said, well, go do something. So his class is on the Sermon on the Mount. So this next quarter, he'll spend the entire thing on chapters 5, 6, and 7 in the book of Matthew. Well, it turns out I went through the book of Matthew, or at least part of it, not that long ago. And so he said, why don't you do a survey of all of the sermons in Matthew? So I said, well, I can do that probably, because when you do that, anytime you say survey of English literature, so you just go through it and you find stuff that's interesting and you talk about it. So there's no point except interesting stuff in all these little sermons that are there. So we'll do that. Well, I hope you brought your lunch. No, it won't be that long. Yeah. I've always been a clock watcher, so you don't have to worry about that. Let's just have a prayer to start class with, and then we'll jump in. Lord, we appreciate very much a morning that we can spend time together. As we come here, it's cool, and the winter looks like it's upon us, but we praise you for the seasons and what that does to our world as things change and get ready to regrow. Father, thank you for your world, that we're in it, and most of all, Father, that you're here with us. And we appreciate Jesus and the story that we have in Matthew, and we appreciate not only the story of things that were done, but also his words to the disciples and to the community around. Please help us appreciate those. And as David takes us on through the Sermon on the Mount, help us to learn, to apply, and to be better servants and stewards of yours. Thank you for Jesus. We appreciate him very much. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so if you can recall, which for me is difficult, probably the first part of this last year, I was up here for a quarter, well, except Bill did it a lot too. So I was up here some, and Bill did a bunch on the book of Matthew. And this was sort of my title slide. If you think about the book of Matthew, there is so much, and I'm going to say because I'm a chemist, so much symmetry in it. It just surprises you when you're able to stand back and look at how things are arranged. You know, we kind of go through sometimes, and we read here, and there's a story. We read here, there's a story. We don't really connect kind of the bigger picture. So we're kind of doing that today. What I've got up here is the book of Matthew, in an arrangement that David will bring up again, I'm sure, because there's a bunch people who did these books liked arranging them. And so a lot of times there is within smaller sections an order, and we'll call it a chiasm. It's from the Greek letter chi, C-H-I, and it's the one that's the big X. Okay, and so it goes broad, comes down to a point, and then goes out again. And so chiasm is just sort of a fancy variation on that Greek letter. Well, if you notice here, I've got it arranged from sort of a broad, and it goes down to a point, and then comes back out again. Okay, and so the book of Matthew, if you look at it, stand back, has that kind of arrangement. And so at the beginning, the birth and beginnings of Jesus is a story that starts, and you go down through lots of different stories and sermons until you hit the parables. And the parables are at the heart of the book of Matthew. And Jay has just finished up the parables, and so they should be fairly fresh in your mind. But when Matthew was putting this together, he focused the parables right at the heart. And so if you want to look at the heart of Matthew, pull out that chapter, what is it, chapter 13, on parables. Right there is the secrets of the kingdom. Okay, if you want to know what Jesus is about and what his kingdom is about and what he sets in motion as he goes through the passion and the resurrection, you see it in the parables. In fact, he even says to the disciples, this is why I'm saying these things. It's for you because you know what's going on. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it comes down to the parables is right at the heart, and then comes back out again. And there's some symmetry with what subjects are at the beginning and the end. So sort of there's sort of a death and rebirth, starting and finishing, blessings, entering the kingdom. Well, that's the Sermon on the Mount. And the blessings come from Beatitudes. And if you look at the symmetrical down the B prime, you get a whole 3 chapters on the Pharisees. And there is judgment galore there. And so they're sort of images of each other. In fact, we'll look a little bit today at some of the symmetry that's between the Sermon on the Mount that David will cover. But you need to really always have in mind this discourse on judgment. That is sort of the same thing. And you see a lot of similarities in things that happen. Just kind of to give you an indication, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are. Well, you go to the symmetrical thing, woe to you. And we'll look at some of the woes and see how they really are sort of roughly mirror images, but they have kind of an interesting symmetry. And then there's some other discourses. There's one, D is the missionary discourse. Jesus sends out his disciples, and their focus is on the lost sheep of Israel. Okay, lost sheep. And when you think of lost sheep, you think of people who are needy, people who are not the greatest in the sense that the Pharisees and all that, but the lost sheep. And on the other sort of the D prime is the community. Okay, and we talk about the community there. And what we're going to see is the same kind of language is there, but it's not the lost sheep of Israel, but it's the little ones. Okay, you take care of the little ones, okay, in this discourse. And then in the center is the parables. There is another diagram, and let's see, this says on. I don't know if you can see that very well. This was done with my phone out of a book, and so I did my best. But you can see there is in a diagram even a lot more symmetry to the book. And the first 12 chapters focus really closely on Jesus and the disciples. Okay, and you can see all sorts of things within that as symmetry. So the Messiah shows up being born, and then just before or just after the missionary discourse, Jesus as Messiah is brought up again in chapter 12. And then you have John the Baptist. No, Jewish leaders. So we have Herod at one end, and he spends his time persecuting Jesus, looking for him, trying to kill him. At the other end, you have other Jewish leaders that are calling Jesus Beelzebub and trying to get rid of him. And so you have sort of the symmetry of the Jewish leaders. You come in, John the Baptist shows up at the baptism of Jesus, and then he's beheaded. And that's the symmetrical chapters there. Some of the disciples you have where they're chosen, and then he sends them out, okay, in some of the chapters. And right at the heart of that is what David's going to cover this time, the Sermon on the Mount for 3 chapters. So some real tight symmetry in the first half of the book, up through 12. The second half, you're not really focused on Jesus and the disciples as much, although they're present, but it's Jesus forming the community. And so we have Jesus in his little group, the 12, and then in the second half, it expands out and they've done their job, and suddenly you have people coming together and forming a new, brand new community in the second half. And so a lot of that is addressed. Okay, so we're going to go through kind of the sermons. The sermons show up in Sermon on the Mount, 5, 6, and 7. The one, you can see at the bottom, there's a dotted line. And the one that is important to kind of keep in mind as you're going through the Sermon on the Mount is the judgment discourse. Okay, at the other end, they're both 3 chapters long. They have some things in them, if you spend time, that there's language that's similar, there's topics that's similar, but the focus is completely, I'm not going to say completely different, but Sermon on the Mount is, here is how you are a person of the kingdom. Okay, the person of the kingdom, and you have the Beatitudes, you have lots of very positive things for you to do, although there is some negative things that are reflected in the judgment. And then on the other end is the judgment. Here's the Pharisees, the scribes, the Jewish leaders, the people that are really in conflict with Jesus. So these 2 sermons, kind of one positive and one very negative. And then you move in, Jesus sends out the disciples, but he also, in the missionary discourse in chapter 10, in chapter 18, there is a sermon to his disciples and to the leaders of this new community. You be kind to your fellow people that are little. Okay, you got the big people and the little people. Well, you be kind. Okay, and so that whole sermon there is about how to treat children. He calls them children, little ones. Here's what this community is all about when it comes to order. And then the parables in the center. So we'll kind of run through those and get a little bit of feeling, and it just came out of my brain. So nothing fancy here. Anything people want to say before we move on?
This is more or less chronological as far as we look at the music. But this is
I'm going to say it is kind of, but it's not necessarily. There were things in these, especially in these sermons, I think that in Mark are in very different places in the book. And they're clearly from Mark or another source, and they come together and they're put together differently. So, yeah, it goes from the beginning of Jesus to the death and resurrection, but I think to pull subject matter together, there's kind of some different arrangements than the other Gospels have. Chad and then Christine. I can text that. I think we have a list out there. That's right. We can email it. We'll send it out in an email. Christine? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, and you think about that in terms of where was Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount? Well, it was a new movement. He had his disciples. They were coming along, and he's saying, here's how you are members of the kingdom. By the other end, if you notice in between about chapter 11 and on past, there is conflict. And conflict grows and grows and grows. And by the end, yeah, that's right. It's very severe language. In fact, something I'll point out as we go along, and I hope you catch on because most of the important stuff has already been said. But there is underlying a lot of it the idea of judgment, okay? And that's not a popular topic, but judgment is there in all of these sermons. Sermon on the Mount, there's a little bit. If you think about it, there's the two paths. There's the wise and foolish builders. A little bit of judgment there, but not a lot. It's really very positive. Here's how you are members of the kingdom. When you get to the judgment discourse, it's called that because it's all judgment all the time, and it's not holding back anything. And what's happened over the course of the life of Jesus in this ministry is that there has been so much conflict. It's just, that's kind of all he had to say about what was, who he was facing off against. Did I do that? Huh. My brain. I can't fix it. Oh, I can. There we go. Here is the parables. So we're jumping right to the center. In fact, if I go back, we're going, Billy, you can't see this, but we're going right to chapter 13. Okay, and we said that was the heart of the book of Matthew. If you want to know why it was written, all this other stuff points to the kingdom that's there. And so it just pulled out a little bit of the chapter 13, and it says the disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" Okay, and so why don't you get down to the nitty-gritty and just say, okay, here's what the deal is, and kind of be a professor. But he says, he replied, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of the heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables." And then he does some quotations from Old Testament prophets. "Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and I would turn and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear." Okay? Is that straightforward? Is it puzzling? Is it clear? Okay. I always thought it was a little bit, I don't know. If you want people to change, you need to tell them straight out instead of stories and stuff. Here it seems like the parables are not quite straightforward, but are they straightforward? Beating around the bush. Okay. What is it that Jesus wants people to see? Let me ask it that way. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, I like that. Yeah. It seems like, there's parables, and they give little hints at what the kingdom is about. I mean, the kingdom grows, I don't think, by big crusades and by, big movements and stuff. What happens, it's like yeast. And so it just happens among people, in families, in groups, but it just works from the bottom up and not a top-down, this is how you do it. And if you think about how the Jewish Pharisees and all that, they were a top-down bunch. Here's what you do, and here's how you do it, and here's when you do it, and, But Jesus says, no, that's not how the kingdom works. It's from the bottom up. So there's all these little pieces of the kingdom you get through the parables. Bill?
Another thing we look at in those days,
The rabbis, yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 And not, yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Right, right. And kind of at the end here, he's talking about, for truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear, but you did. I really think that even beyond the parables, looking at Jesus and what he does and what happens coming up is a big deal in this whole, what is the kingdom about? The big grand finale of the book is the death, burial, and resurrection. And resurrection is front and center. In fact, just before this parable chapter, there is the Pharisees coming to Jesus and saying, we want a sign. If you're for real, we want to see it. We want to hear it. And what Jesus says is, you don't get that. What you're going to get is the sign of Jonah. What's the sign of Jonah? Okay, the resurrection. Okay, he came up out of a fish. Well, you're going to see me come up out of the grave. And so I think what they're seeing and hearing is looking, well, here's bits and pieces through the parables, but you watch me and see what happens, and there is the bigger story that people have longed for. Biddy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Just doesn't work, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Makes sense and all that, yeah. Mm-hmm. There you go. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. No, just the meaning is in the story. Rules and regulations. I mean, after the first of the year, I'm going to lose this gut because I know it's right, but it's not going to happen. It will be gone. And so there's some internal thing that has to happen before that. Bruce? Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Mm-hmm. And internalize it, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's nice, yeah. It's a whole different way of learning rather than just the rules and regulations, so, yeah. Right, Randy? Mm-hmm. It doesn't, yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. They give us meaning and place. Mm-hmm. 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 Doesn't do it this way. Yeah, yeah. Good point. Good point. The book has stories galore. Yeah. Well, I don't know where we are. I just wanted to point out that judgment starts showing up. This is the center of the book. And judgment starts showing up here in pretty healthy amount. So if you just look at chapter 13, it begins out, that same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake, and such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore, and he told them many things in parables. And then you get the sower, you get the weeds, you get the mustard seed and yeast, you get the hidden treasure, the pearl, and the net. So lots of stories about how does this kingdom grow, and all of it is gut level. Okay, not many rules and regulations, it's story. But then at the end I wanted to point out, because I've said several times that judgment, which we're not going to get much of, we get a little bit of it in the Sermon on the Mount, but it's going to increase and increase and increase. And here's a pretty good chunk, even in the middle of Matthew, before we get to the grand judgment discourse. And so down at the bottom, the theme of judgment grows as the book of Matthew progresses. And in chapter 13, verse 37 and following, he says, he answered, the one who sowed, this is where he's explaining the parable of the sower. So he's talking to his disciples. He says, the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed stands for people in the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. Harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are the angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear. So that's a pretty hefty chunk of judgment right there, at least in my opinion. And it's kind of in the middle of the book. As we go on, it's going to get even more as Jesus is more in conflict and is facing off more and more with his opponents, especially the Jewish leaders, but also the political entities of the time. Anything before we pass on from this? Mm-hmm. 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 There's some personal things here to think about. Yeah. No. Right. Although I will say in the book of Matthew, he makes a distinction of his disciples and his people and his little ones, people of the kingdom, and the other folks. And so I guess the thought for us, the meaning, the story is, what kingdom? Choose the way. Okay. Can't be perfect at it, but you got to plant your feet somewhere. So that was the parables. So that was this guy. And so let's just talk for a little bit about these other two. So coming out a little bit, the missionary discourse. So he has chosen his disciples, and he is about to send them out. And so I just took some little chunks out of here. So this is edited, just so I could fit it on a slide. And so the missionary discourse in chapter 10, these 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter into any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the, I thought this would work so well. Oh, lost sheep of Israel. Oh, okay, that one's not so bad. You guys can read that. I can't read that back there. Okay, go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. Okay, and I think that's an important point right here, and really sets up the symmetry with the little ones in the community discourse that's sort of symmetrical with this. So he's going to a specific group, the lost ones, the little ones of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely you give. And so that's their mission. The interesting part to me is there is a little bit of preaching, okay? A little bit of preaching. And here's the kingdom, and it's at hand. But how does he prove that? Okay, it's not through teaching and instruction and rules and regulations like they're used to, but it is heal the sick, raise the dead. Okay, I see some of that going on. I'm thinking there's some serious stuff here that these guys are about. And I think that is part of when we were back in the parables, who has ears, let them hear. If you see something, you can always rationalize it away. I hear people, they want to see God face to face before they'll believe in him. But even if they saw God face to face, they would think they were just hallucinating or something. And so you can always rationalize things. And it's kind of getting to the heart of things when you say, this is what the truth is, and I'm going to stand on it. That's different than seeing healing, dead raising, cleansing from leprosy, driving out demons, all that stuff. You can rationalize it away. But I think what he's saying is if you have ears and you see it and you hear it, that's where you need to be. Any thoughts about that? Mm-hmm. That won't even work. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. They are doing what they want to do. They've made themselves God rather than stopping and seeing the world and how they fit in as servants and stewards and all this. It's interesting that in this discourse here where he talks about the missionary sending out the 12, okay, they are supposed to do exactly what Jesus did. And that's the next little section there I chopped out, verse 24. The student is not above the teacher. So in other words, what you've seen me doing, that's what you do. Okay, that's how you're part of the kingdom, is you do what I do. The student is not above the teacher, nor the servant above his master. It is enough for students to be like their teachers, servants like their masters. If the head of the house has been called Beelzebul, how much more the members of his household? Somebody tell me about that. Why is that thrown in there? Beelzebul. At least some god or some evil spirit, yeah. Well, it showed up in the last chapter. Okay, so Jesus was doing all these things, healing the sick, raising the dead, cleansing those who have leprosy, all of that stuff. And what the Jewish leaders and the Pharisees and the folks said was, you're doing that by the power of Beelzebul. Okay? And so that was not just a small thing, but that shows up several times in this book. Is you're not doing this by God, by being a member of the kingdom, you're doing it by an evil presence. Ted?
It reminds me of several places in the Old Testament where, whoever leaders are at that time, go and kill them.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Never tied in? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So get that culture kind of cleansed. Yeah, that's rough. It's rough to think about, but yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of his sending it out, and he sends them out, and he tells them to do all sorts of things that we wouldn't like. They're not supposed to get a room at the Holiday Inn. They're not supposed to have enough money to buy food. They go out and they just live in faith. And so they trust the people, they dig in with them, and they do this ministry. Let me just go ahead and point out here that, again, we've got some judgment at the end. And down at the bottom, as he's talking to them, and he's saying, it's kind of in the context of family, but I think the family needs to be a bigger picture. So, yeah, Christianity can bring conflict in families, but I think when you have a close-knit community like the Jewish nation was, it expands there. And what he's telling the disciples as they go in is, you're going to be tearing up the pieces that are holding this whole society, this community together, and that's going to be a problem. And so he uses family language, but I think it's bigger than family. It says, do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against his mother, a daughter-in-law against their mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. But whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. So we have kind of a family set of language here and images, but I think it really is the disciples going into this community because they're brothers and sisters with the fellow Jews, and that was kind of the way they looked at it. Strong family ties, strong clan ties, strong group ties. And so that's where they're headed when they're out doing what Jesus did. Yeah, Chad? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or this or that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Had a whole lineage, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. That makes you somebody, yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. You're going to be interested in little ones that you don't even know. And so that's what makes you important, is you become like a child, and your whole culture, your whole way of viewing the world is going to change. So, Christine? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To God. There you go. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right down the middle. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Well, Chad is ringing some bells. I'm going to jump way down because I knew this would happen. But just a couple things to kind of put the Sermon on the Mount in context. So let's jump down. Sermon on the Mount is here, and David is going to cover that in detail over the next few months. And so let me just kind of point out that, oh, I'm sorry. I did. You can't see it back there either? Why do it then? So David's going to focus on this one, but we shouldn't forget this one when we're going through there, because it's a good counterpoint to much of what he's going to say. Here's how you do it. Here's how you don't do it. And so it really is a good thing. So let me find it. Let's see. Community discourse. Here we go. Sermon on the Mount. There are just some similarities in topics, and I just picked these out because it was real obvious. If you spent time looking at it, there would be a lot that is kind of the negative, positive in these two. And so here, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. And so here's how you go to church. You see the important folks come out. They're going to throw their money in the plate when it passes, but they're also going to blow some trumpets because they want people to know that the money went in. I mean, that is much different than this community Jesus describes with yeast and with little ones. And the way it's grown is you end up being important because people see you as the rabbi. In verse 5, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. So here is to the disciples, here's what you don't do, kind of in the Sermon on the Mount. You get the same kind of thing over here. Here's the judgment discourse, and judgment is 23, 24, and 25, so 3 chapters. There's a lot to it we won't get to. But he introduces the whole thing by really saying, here's what these people do when they're at church. Okay, and so Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they tell you, or what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide, their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. Okay, and Jesus goes on and says, you don't call each other rabbi. That's not what you do. Okay, so interesting language. A lot of topics show up in both places, and so you need to kind of keep your eye there. Another kind of interesting thing to me is the Beatitudes. Here's the Sermon on the Mount. We get, 10 Beatitudes, 11, somewhere in there. And I've always thought about these. Blessed are, and you can go through poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek. It's interesting in the book of Luke, not here, Jesus, when he gives the Beatitudes, it says specifically he's looking in the disciples' eyes. And so, when I was a kid, I remember looking at these, which one of these am I? But in fact, we are all of them. So we are all of them. And I think he really had compassion and optimism for his disciples. And so he looked them in the eye and he said, this is what you're about. Okay, and it starts off the whole sermon. There you go. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's describing a whole attitude and not just, I want to be a peacemaker, so I'm going to be a policeman or something. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the point I'm making here is there's some interesting, and they're not direct comparisons, but the language is quite similar as you go from one side to the other. Over here in the judgment discourse, after he says, here's what the Pharisees do, they pile burdens on people, they don't do what they say, and they like to be seen by others. He then goes through the woes. And the woes, I think, are kind of the anti-Beatitudes. And so, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. And then it goes on for some ways. You shut the, I forget now what it is even that they shut. I cut it off too late or too early. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. And so he goes down all this way, and whatever blessing is, there's been a discussion over the years as what does it mean in the Beatitudes of what blessing is. Well, it's the opposite of what woes are. And so you have kind of the symmetry there, kind of anti-symmetry there in there. So just a couple of things. Topics in the judgment discourse show up in the Sermon on the Mount that need to be looked at. Also, there are some methods of communication, some words that are there that show up both places that are important. Any final thing to say? I heard a bell. All right. Go drink some coffee.